Hello. This is going to be the last week of presentations. It's the week 11 presentation on comparative politics. And our group is actually so big that we had to split into two. So this group, Sam, Juliana, Cam, Aya, and Jenna, we're going to be covering sexuality in Islam, that article, and then also the article that talked about predictors of attitudes towards gay men and lesbian women. So the first article that we're going to look at is predictors of attitudes towards gay men and lesbian women in 23 countries. This article was published in 2019, so it's a bit newer. I know some of the articles that we've been looking at have been a bit, older, like from the early 2000s, but this article has fairly updated and recent information and research in it. So first, I just wanted to give like a background to the article and a little overview of the literature review section where they kind of talked about the different predictors of attitudes. So the main predictor of attitudes that was looked at in this article was gender norms. And basically, if you don't know, gender norms are shared societal and cultural beliefs about how men and women should behave and act. Gender norms are typically viewed as very heteronormative. Traditional heteronormative norms include men being strong and non-emotional, not showing emotion, being the provider, and women are categorized as passive and vulnerable and more emotional. So, like I said, norms like these are very heteronormative. So, homosexuality, gay men, lesbian women, bisexual people, transgender people, they would all fall outside of traditional norms, as this article kind of classified it. So basically, when it had been studied previously, research suggested that when looking at negative attitudes, that men were the targets and perpetrators of this prejudice, so when it came to gender norms. So basically what that means, if we could break that down a little, is that gay men, or just even more effeminate men, were seen as targets of prejudice and negative attitudes. So men just who didn't fit into the heteronormative kind of and hyper-masculine view of what society perceives men should be, were viewed with overwhelmingly negative attitudes, and they were usually viewed that way by men themselves. So the research also showed that women typically didn't really hold this view, which, if you think about it, makes sense based on the norms that are being forced onto people. So I think that that research sort of makes sense. But the researchers pointed out it had only been really studied well in Western nations, so it had really only been looked at in places like the U.S. And I think, this class, we've really only looked at like kind of what's happened in the U.S., so it's definitely interesting to get a view of what is going on in other parts of the world in accordance with LGBT plus rights. So the researchers wanted to look more at the attitudes and the public opinion of gay men and lesbian women, outside of kind of this Western worldview. So they pointed out that gender and culture are both really understudied when you look at sexuality. So gender obviously being the norms part, and even I'm thinking back to some of the studies that we looked at, really did just look at homosexuality as like a whole big clump. It didn't really look at gay men, lesbian women, it didn't really like break down those classifications. So they wanted to do that. They wanted to break that down and make sure they were looking at gender as a factor as well. And then they also wanted to look at culture. They wanted to look at more countries that were outside of the Western, like United States, Western Europe kind of bubble. They also pointed out, and looked at a few, but not all, they just pointed out that many things have been correlated with positive and negative reactions to homosexuality. So the article mentions gender equality. If the country has a better rate of gender equality, they're more likely to have a positive attitude towards homosexuality. If the country is more religious, more likely to have a negative reaction to homosexuality. And if a country has high levels of inequality, this one's pretty interesting, the rich in the country with high levels of inequality will have positive reactions to homosexuality, but the poor in an unequal society will have a more negative reaction to homosexuality. So there's just a lot of things you can think about when you're trying to predict these attitudes. So the research methods and sort of style that was used to find the results, um, they the authors researched and analyzed the relationship that we were talking about earlier between gender norms, and attitudes towards gay men and lesbian women in 23 countries. They just focused on gay men and lesbian women for this article. They looked at 16 Western and 7 non-Western countries. So while it still was better than some other research where like they hadn't even looked at non-Western countries at all, there's still an obvious overbalance, or there's more Western countries basically than non-Western countries. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. So they basically wanted to test 3 findings that they had talked about in the beginning of the article that were from past research. They wanted to test if attitudes about gay men were really more negative than attitudes about lesbian women. They wanted to test if men really were more prejudiced than women. And they wanted to test if the presence of traditional gender norms is associated with sexual prejudice. So just overall, was there a presence of traditional gender norms in this society or country, and could that be correlated with their prejudice towards gay men and lesbian women? So the survey was done online, and participants rated how they felt towards several groups. So basically, in the survey, they didn't use words like gay or lesbian because those tend to have a negative connotation, especially in certain countries and societies. So they used terms like women in relationships with women, men in relationships with men, that sort of thing. And then they also rated how they felt about social norms, both traditional and non-traditional, and other demographic information that had been indicated as important in previous research. So like I talked about with the last slide, things like, age, maybe financial status, things like that. And they also did a little research that measured the legal rights of LGBT people in the 23 countries. I think it's also important to point out that in the 23 countries, especially in the ones that were more non-Western, and in a few of the countries where internet access was not as reliable, or there wasn't not many people in the country have internet access or reliable internet access. The article did point out that the respondents in those countries tended to be from higher income individuals. So that, also may have played a factor in how those countries responded. So just something to keep in mind.
Hi everyone, I'm Samantha. I'm going to be talking about the results and discussion section of our first article. So across all countries, men held more negative attitudes towards sexual minorities than women did, but there was no relationship between gender and attitudes towards lesbian women. For example, in China, France, and Italy, men, as opposed to women, reported more negative attitudes towards lesbian women, but in Mexico and the United States, women, as opposed to men, were much more prejudiced against lesbian women. However, in all the countries in this study, gay men were seen more negatively than lesbian women. In Western countries, as this was discussed in the literature review, and this is kind of what has already a lot of research on it, there's a clear pattern showing gender norm endorsement negatively correlated with pro-gay attitudes in Western countries, but this is kind of more all over the place in non-Western countries in this study. So Russia, South Africa, and Turkey showed similar patterns to Western countries, but the opposite was true in China and India. So gender norm endorsement was positively related to pro-gay attitudes. In Japan, gender norm endorsement was negatively related to attitudes towards gay men, but did not have any relation to attitudes towards lesbian women. And then in South Korea, there was no relationship between the variables. Also important to consider, I thought, was that prejudice is higher in countries with fewer protections for sexual minorities. So now if we move more into discussion out of the results, gay men may be more disliked than with lesbian women because women tend to be less noticed, more in the background in the public sphere in patriarchal societies, which comprise most societies. Men's attitudes and beliefs also tend to be more affected by societal norms. The connection between gender norms and attitudes about sexuality exists across cultures, so it's not very likely to be a product of any certain religion or cultural orientation. And then it's important to acknowledge that gender norms and sexual orientation are viewed differently in India and Southeast Asia. There's an opposite or non existent connection between gender role endorsement and views towards gay and lesbians, as we already talked about. This might be a result of modernization and Western influence coming into that modernization process, but it's hard to tell just from these results. It would need further research. And then to think the point to tie all of these results together is that association between gender norm endorsement and sexual prejudice doesn't hold true in many non-Western countries as it does in Western countries.
Okay, so in conclusion, we can determine that gender norms and social bias are less prevalent in non Western countries, and that the recognition of the same sex relationships in the non Western countries may have influenced the surrounding countries' policies to adjust as well. They kind of began to normalize the sexual expression in other countries surrounding. Western countries are struggling to adapt to due to the patriarchal nature of society and the role of men in society and how women are often overlooked. Heteronormative social bias is how we like to assimilate things as humans, and we see heterosexual relationships as the normal. With the results of the study, we can determine that there are a lot of similarities between countries, and there's also various differences, specifically between the Western and non Western. Western countries are more observably presenting the association of gender norm enforcement and sexual orientation. And when working in comparative politics, it's important to take account the social biases of the observed and the compared countries. For example, when we're comparing the Western countries with a non Western country, a political standpoint on LGBT rights could be drastically different because of the social biases that are different in each country.
This is Aya, and the first thing I want to talk about in the section on Islam. The paper shows some disclaimers I wish to bring to the article and pieces to or points to bring to further the discussion. The first thing I want to bring is the lack of citation in this piece. This article is primarily one of sociology, how this person who's seemingly from Morocco, how Islamic society is to them, but how that what that brings with it is that they fall short on the citation, uh, especially from the religious side of things, where often they cite things that are seemingly anecdotes, and with an article that's titled Sexuality and Islam, it seems to fall short of that title, and it's more Sexuality and Islam in Morocco. For example, there's the they are one of the things they cite is the common quote common sense of what the common sense in Islamic common sense. And they state for the Islamic constant quote only the horrors of virginity before marriage. Now the problem with this is not universal. Common sense is not something that's if you just label common sense, it's not something that's very citable, very reliable, that it is actually a prevalent opinion, even in the society, let alone in all the Islamic world. Um, and that and that is and the author does this sort of thing throughout the article where they seem to be anecdotes and not really uh, backed up with proper citation. And the one I would like to bring up the most is the article called "The Algerian Woman," which they cite from in the article. Now, in the article, they talk about how there's levels of modernization, which are creating a unequal sexual morality within Islamic countries. Um, Now, the thing is, this article was written in 2010, and yet they have research such as this one talking about the society that is far older. The Algerian Woman, as I put on the screen, is from 1969, um, which, as a source for talking about how society is, isn't a very good, doesn't stand on firm ground when you're trying to talk about how society has modernized when your sources are several decades old. Now the quote itself, as you can see here, it says, consequently, any woman in the urban public space is considered by the Muslim man to be within reach. In his mind, how could a woman be inaccessible when one can see her naked at the beach, or when one can be close to her in a bus? How can one avoid being unceasingly aroused by the proximity of bodies which is far from being normalized? Thus, excitement of people confronted since a short time with town life will be chronic and diffuse, owing to a long-standing cited unfairness for sexual coexistence in the public space. Now, additionally, this quote, as I mentioned a bit before, is seemingly anecdote and is also a sweeping generalization and seems to paint Muslim men as unable to control themselves and wanting to. Uh, it seems to insinuate that no Muslim men can help themselves from sexually assaulting any woman now that they have the freedom. Continuing from the previous slide, um, some of the problems with this article and things to bring up the audience discussion are, for one, variations within Islam. I'll just um, like like to bring obviously that, but like I mentioned before, this isn't this the Islam that the author paints in this article is not universal. There's many different ways that Islam is expressed and seen all throughout the world. Um, so, I mean, obviously um, there's going to be differences, and this is primarily an article about how Islam is seen in Morocco, and I just wish to reinforce that once again. The other thing is, in the article, the author uh, references several references Sharia and talks about um, the punishments for someone who is homosexual within Islam. The problem with this, I would just like to bring up, is that Sharia is not again, Sharia is not universal. Sharia is, just for a disclaimer about Sharia, Sharia is not simply based on the Quran. Is also based on the Sunnah, which is the actions of Muhammad, and the Ahadith, which are the sayings of Muhammad, along with the decisions of scholars. So it varies greatly within the Muslim world, and I just like to bring that up. The next thing, which is sort of brought up in the last slide, would be on how um, I I think that this piece serves as a good thing to talk about for Moroccan society and how it is seen, but I I think that it fails on several fronts for the religion itself and talking about sexuality within Islam, the entirety of Islam. Sort of building off of that is that this person is certainly coming from a place they are, as far as I can tell, they are sociologists. They are not scholar of religious studies. Um, so a lot of their uh, conclusions and assertions come from that point of view. One of them is that the way to help the how repressive Islam is through the reinterpretation of repressive text. Now, one of the things is again that Islam is not universal, and there are many interpretations that differ significantly than the one that the author is indicating from this article that exists in Morocco, and that uh, it is not, at times, is not necessarily necessary to reinterpret in a new light as much as rediscover how it was originally seen within the context of what within the context of how it was originally. The next thing I wanted to talk about, which is sort of the biggest disclaimer I have to put with this article, is what they say about the ahadith in the article. Now ahadith is the plural of hadith, and it is the sayings of the, Muhammad. Now, um, I have a quote here on one of the things, on one of the citations from the article, where where the author stated that consequently sodomy is forbidden, as some hadiths attest. Who takes someone from behind is cursed. Sodomy of woman is illicit. Who takes a woman from behind is not seen by God on Judgment Day. And sodomy of the wife, this minor homosexuality. Now, the thing is that all ahadith are not made equal. There exists even a science of hadith, and even there are many cases in history of ahadith being fabricated and very more akin to rumors than the actual sayings of Muhammad. Um, and furthermore, this citation also goes back to what I talked about a little bit ago about how there's not very much citation, and furthermore doesn't even talk about it. Like there's not a lot of citation, which is crucial when you're talking about hadith. Now there are, and adding to this, there are three basic levels of hadith, which that is Sahih, which is the highest level, that is the most reliable. Hasan, which is sort of it's pretty good, and then there's Daif, which is poor. Now the problem with not citing this is that this could very much, all these ahadith that the author quotes could very well be the lowest level when you're talking about ahadith, particularly when you're talking about what is society and law in an Islamic country. You want to be talking about sahih level ahadith. Now, secondly, that even if you have sahih hadith, that is not sahih for every Muslim. This sort of goes back to how this Islam that the author paints is not universal, and that even the most sahih collection of hadith, the most trusted collection of the hadith, the Sahih al-Bukhari, is not universally seen as sahih. It is seen sahih by a majority of Sunni Muslims, which Morocco is majority Sunni, um, but that still leaves out, at the very least, Shia Muslims, which is uh, one 1 out of 10 Muslims in the entire world. Um,
Okay, so the first thing that I wanted to talk about from the article was premarital sexuality. And premarital female sexuality is a direct result of the elevation of the mean age at the first marriage and of the existence of sexual substitute practices because of the taboo of the virginity, but this does not necessarily mean defloration. Through sex, girls seek to satisfy their desire to be rewarded in return for their services, to emigrate, or even just to forget sometimes. By the end of the 1970s, 9% of Moroccan youngsters adopted the Islamic refusal of premarital sex, and 45% had already had sexual relations. By the end of the 1980s, 65% of married women admitted having sexual intercourse at least once before marriage. But usually women who claim assets like a diploma, wealth, or a good family are usually not sorry that they lost their virginity before marriage. But in some cases, it's possible to seter the hymen before the wedding, which means, kind of just making it seem like you're still a virgin even if you aren't. So so women who have had premarital sex are still able to get married without all of the backlash that would happen. So the next thing I wanted to touch on from the article was prostitution. And most prostitutes belong to lower social classes and have usually experienced some sort of past psychological trauma. From the Islamic common sense, only the whore loses her virginity before marriage. And like I mentioned in my last slide, the hymen is a really important asset for some of these girls. Without the hymen, sometimes they're considered discarded, damaged, not really cared about anymore. And but the higher the social class, the more assets you have. For example, if you are in a higher social class, you have wealth to offer, not just your hymen. But political power may encourage prostitution under the pretense that people then fare better and take responsibility for themselves. Rather prostitution than poverty. So the next thing I wanted to touch on from the article was from practical homosexuality to homosexual identity. Patriarchal sexuality was normalized in the medieval era. It encompassed the hierarchical relationship between master and his disciple, the Quranic schoolmaster and his pupil, and the craftsman and his apprentice. Hierarchical homosexual relationships resemble hierarchical heterosexual relationships based on two things: domination and pedestry is normalized and socially accepted. There are also two types of adult passive homosexuality: the hassas, which is someone who likes to be penetrated by choice, and the zamil, who offers himself for money. These are both socially admitted, and neither of these examples are considered demasculizing.
The active partner, who is the penetrator, is also not considered to be homosexual and is often referred to as a loquat in references to the Bible prophet Loth. The loquat penetrates males and females but does not accept to be penetrated, and he's not considered to be homosexual or bisexual. And homosexuality is a term for those who are penetrated. So the Kif enabled homosexuals in Morocco to communicate with each other on the internet. Um, and there were also a bunch of high politicians and high officials that were in favor of this group too. In conclusion, according to the rulers of Islam, a reform of Islamic sexual morals is unthinkable and unnecessary. The only solution to achieve reform in the name of Islam is through reinterpretation of repressive texts. Islam/sexuality leads to two considerations. The first one is that there is inequality between Muslim countries about sexual matters, and the second one is the modernization of sexual attitudes and behaviors proceeds at an unequal pace in the same country, which ultimately just ties into things evolve at a different pace. Pre and extramarital sex have become more frequent, and illegal sexual behaviors induce less feelings of guilt. And today, Islam is not the only reference in which people can get guidance regarding sexual practice.